After a hard morning of swabbing, our recruit would have earned themselves a spot of breakfast. Contrary to the myth, sailors in Nelson's Navy actually ate pretty well. The Navy looked after its seamen. They had to, because they had to have the strength and the morale to sail and fight these enormous ships, particularly given the diet in the Georgian slums at the time. Sailors would have been very excited to have meat 4 days a week. On Saturdays, they had this, 2 pounds of salt beef. Now this looks slightly more appetising than it would have looked back in the early 19th century. There the beef would have been packed into casks, perhaps for years on end, covered in salt to preserve it, and be so hard it was almost said to be like a piece of wood that you could varnish. Still, what a treat. You'd eat that alongside the carbohydrates, the famous ship's biscuits. These are baked hard in special naval facilities around Britain. They too could be packed in casks and transported over huge distances before they just fell apart. Even so, there are some legendary stories about just how hard and disgusting these got. The ship's cook cooked for the men, the ordinary and able seamen. The officers had their own cooks, their own supplies. They ate very well, thank you, back there at the stern of the ship. He'd take a great big vat, he'd pour in some meat, he'd pour in old bits of biscuit, and he'd create these kind of stews. There was a weird sort of slush that rose to the surface that he could skim off and do with it what he will. It was a perk of the job. You could sell them to rope makers, for example, to make them more resistant to wind and weather. The cook benefited from what was known as the slush fund. So this was on high days and holidays, but 3 days a week, it was no meat for you. Instead it was oatmeal, about half a pint of peas, and then equally dispersed amount of cheese, butter and sugar. It's said by modern nutritionists that the naval diet of the Georgian Navy gave seafarers about 5,000 calories a day, which is what you'd expect for young men doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. And all of that, of course, had to be washed down with something. Beer. Now again, the myth here is that the Navy drank nothing but grog, rum mixed with water and a bit of lemon juice. But in fact, beer was the staple drink. It wasn't the kind of full-strength beer we get nowadays. It's thought to be a little bit weaker, small beer. But they had a gallon a day. Now that wasn't quite as insane as it sounds, because our beer was probably better for you than most drinking water, which could have been pulled out of the Thames or somewhere like that. The brewing process meant that many of the microbes, many of the nasty diseases were killed off. And so beer stored in casks might keep the crew healthier than drinking water. Of course, when the beer ran out, that's when you had to turn to the local tipple. If your ship was serving in the Mediterranean, you might take arak or wine, which needed a lot of watering down. If you were in the Caribbean, well, you're near the sugar plantations, and that meant rum, the famous grog. That was about 4 parts water to 1 part rum, lemon juice added to keep the scurvy away, and a bit of brown sugar as well. It should be said, predictably, that sailors were world-leading experts in smuggling their own supplies of booze aboard ship. Captains would supplement this basic diet wherever they could. They knew that a well-fed crew was likely to be a happy and effective crew. Nelson's letters are full of accounts of him trying to find decent food, drinks, water for his men, keep their health in good shape. And that meant captains started experimenting in the 18th century and early 19th, particularly when it came to scurvy, a disease they didn't quite realise caused by deficiency of vitamin C that led to complete debilitation and death. One way of dealing with scurvy was very unpopular. Sauerkraut, kept a long time, full of vitamin C, a superfood. A little more popular, the lemon, replaced by limes later in the 19th century, but a very reliable way of keeping scurvy at bay. The Admiralty declared that when it came to food and drink, the sailors should be given the best of everything. Now, I think it would be quite a stretch to claim this was the best that Georgian Britain could offer. But certainly, compared to their peers on land or in other industries, sailors of Nelson's Navy pretty well looked after.